Good morning. Let's make a quick run through Chapter 3. And, this is a chapter we talk about forms of ownership of businesses that you could teach a full semester on this easily. In fact, I'm sure in law school and probably accounting schools, they probably teach more than a full semester on this subject. At the undergraduate level, we touch on it in several different courses. You're going to get it in business law. I'm sure you get it in accounting. We talk about it in finance. Depending on your minor. Here we are in small business management, entrepreneurship. We talk about it a little bit more. So, we try to hit it often because of the importance that it has. It's just a big factor oftentimes. That said, and again, good questions to ask of the folks that might be coming in, who should have a lawyer and an accountant both coming in to talk to the class. So, most businesses, when people just start out, especially small ones that really develop, they kind of start as sole proprietorships or maybe a partnership, general partnership, but oftentimes they evolve, and the election then to change the business form happens at a later time. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that, right? Why would we have a proprietorship? What are some pros and cons? For you guys that are in Group 3 that should be attacking this one, I think it's Group 3. It should be fairly easy to come up with a lot of questions here, right? Reasons for and against a partnership, for and against a corporation, other legal forms. We'll talk about limited partnerships and limited liability companies and those types of things, right? These are questions that sometimes get answered. I would say, in fact, the two big questions, and one of them's not on here, and one of the reasons we have an accountant coming in, right? Because to me, the two big questions are oftentimes this: the limit to liability is a huge factor for one, and two is the tax consequences of selecting different forms of organization. And of course, here we go. Taxes are on the next page, right? Earnings reinvestment and those types of things are I think kind of minor. The expected profit or loss, that gets into I can honestly tell you in banking, I had customers maybe, wife's a doctor and makes a lot of money, and husband goes out and starts his own business and actually perpetually shows a loss, which they use to write off, of course, against the wife's income as a doctor. And so in some cases they would actually do those things for some kinds of tax planning and those, etc. So you won't see a ton of that, but I saw that occasionally. So lots of proprietorships, fewer corporations, but corporations bring in the most dough. Think Amazon, think Apple, right? And that's why. I mean, it takes a ton. It would take a gazillion small businesses, sole proprietorships to make up for the types of volume that Exxon, Walmart, Apple, Amazon, et cetera, right, do. You also have to think that because of their great size, they have skinnier margins. Those big companies do, but they're selling, literally billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of stuff. So I think Walmart just a couple of years ago passed the $1 billion a day mark, right? So relative importance of each, proprietorships, right? Why or why not? Who starts them? How many do you see? Do you have to see a lawyer? Do you have to see an accountant? Honestly, in a proprietorship, a simple one, I think most people, especially most people that have gone through college, could probably even do the tax return. You do a Schedule C, and you fill that out, and you attach that then with your 1040, and away you go, right? Partnerships can be similar to a proprietorship. You just have more than one person, right? Corporations then start to get a lot more complicated, and there's a couple different types of corporations. So I'll skip through some of these. You certainly might want to look at them, and you can look at the PowerPoints I think that I have posted. But advantages and disadvantages, and questions that we can certainly ask our guests. Same thing, advantages and disadvantages of partnerships. One question that's maybe always kind of fun to ask is if they have any stories of partnerships that have gone awry. Sometimes that can get to be somewhat interesting, and sometimes, oftentimes it's maybe because they didn't have agreements and those types of things up front to handle it. So, good fun questions to ask, I think, and nothing wrong with that. And you could certainly ask that of other entities that would have more than one person in them, right? Advantages and disadvantages of partnerships. Again, might be some good questions. You read through these, and ask our guests, and successes in partnerships too. While they've probably seen some epic failures, they've probably seen some epic successes too that have come out of that. So, general partnerships, there's each partners actively involved in it, and they also share the liability, even if they weren't the one responsible for the act, right? And so that gets to be a little bit scary, and that's why you see people move away from general partnerships maybe, or they insure, for those types of losses, and that's fine too. Sometimes the insurance is cheaper than forming the other entity or whatnot. Limited partnership, then you limit one person's liability or more than one person's liability to what their investment is. So they could still lose, if they put in 50 grand for this business to get started, that's always at risk. Okay, but it could be limited to that, meaning that if the partnership gets sued for some reason, that limited partner might not be subject to any more loss, whereas the general partner, you still have a general partner, would still be subject to that kind of a loss. So, do you have to have partnership agreement? The answer in Montana is no. There's no requirement for a partnership agreement. Again, I think if we ask our lawyer and our accountant whether they recommend one, that might be a really good question. Corporations, these are the ones that are in the news, that we read about and hear about. Again, the Amazons, the Microsofts, those types are obviously all corporations, but they happen here too on a local basis too. I would tell you that in Montana, probably there's a lot of family farm and ranch corporations. It's a good question to ask our guests as to why, and I'll let them explain. There's certainly some very positives for that. There's also disadvantages to a corporation, especially for smaller businesses that aren't farms and ranches, and I think that that's a question that may end up taking up a good portion of the time, when we do our interview, and that's fine. C corporation is a regular corporation. Again, those are the ones that we see, the Amazons, the Googles, the on and on. They're typically C corporations. Okay, they're public corporations are going to be C corporations. The thing about those is that they are double taxed, and we should ask that question of our guests to explain the double taxation of C corporations, right? Okay. And I think if we hit on those things that I just talked about, there are some of those advantages and disadvantages that we'll see. Corporations also have more requirements, reporting requirements, and those are things that are important both, I think, for our attorney and our accountant that are going to be coming in to really explain about those. So we want to ask some questions about those different types of, oftentimes they're annual. Sometimes they can be more often than that, where they're required to do certain reporting because they are C corporations. Okay. Here's things. Articles of incorporation that you have to have. These are some of the reporting requirements actually that I was just talking about, but we'll let them be a little bit more specific as to what those are. Corporate charter kind of tells what business they're going to be in, who's going to organize it, who are the incorporators, who are the probably board of directors, those types of things. And then a buy-sell agreement on how shareholders can buy each other out. We probably won't get into that a whole lot. Here's corporate governance, right? We get shareholders are the ultimate controllers, okay, but typically they don't do the day-to-day stuff. That usually falls on the corporate officers, with a board of directors in between, kind of setting the direction, right, of the corporation. In small corporations, and here's one thing that's important, you could have a corporation with one person, right? That person's the shareholder, that person is the board, and that person is the corporate officer. That can happen. Then we need to ask about S corporations. We're talking about C corporations. S corporations are different in how they can be taxed. There's some other rules, and I could spout those off approximately, but I think our lawyer and accountant will maybe be a little bit more specific on rules that separate an S corporation from a C corporation. LLCs, and I think a good question. It was kind of my experience even 20 years ago when I was still in banking, and I think to this day that LLCs have become a popular form of organization, and simply because of what it says here. It combines the advantages of the corporation with also the advantages of a partnership or sole proprietorship, and so they become popular. That said, they're not popular for farms and ranches, family farms and ranches in our area, and that might be another good question. Why? Why wouldn't they do those? Limited liability partnerships, I think we'll see that in the attorney that's coming in. No, I've had attorneys come in the past that their structure was a limited liability partnership, but certainly we could ask the pros and cons of that. The accountant that's coming in is from Whipfley, and theirs might be a limited liability partnership. So we could certainly ask, if that's how their organizations are set up, that they come from, and why they set them up that way. I think that's extremely important. I think you'll see these more in professional types of organizations, like attorneys and maybe like accountants. And then same with this, professional service corporations, or PCs, usually is what I see them as opposed to PSC, but a PC is a professional corporation, and specifically for those types of professions, attorneys, doctors, maybe lawyers, or accountants, etc. So, and then you got nonprofit corporations, and there a lot of us have probably been involved in those through the years. A lot of nonprofits set up to do those types of things. So. Excuse me, I had to sneeze there. Cooperatives would be kind of interesting to discuss. Here it says that they're usually associated with purchasing, selling, and financing farm products, and you think there are some big cooperatives that are involved in those things. However, I think in our local area we see cooperatives that are set up for many other things. For example, Triangle Telephone, or Rural Electric, or in our case Hill County Electric. Credit unions are actually a cooperative form of business. Joint ventures, probably we don't see a lot of those things in our local area. You'll read the news every now and then about maybe two companies are forming a joint venture. Maybe GE and Boeing would form a joint venture to produce a military grade weapon or something for the government. Some things like that. We might ask if our local folks here, our local attorney and local accountant, have seen some local examples of that. And you might see two construction firms, for example, and maybe one specializes in moving dirt and one specializes in putting up buildings, but maybe they form a joint venture to enter into a contract, right, with the state. Those types of things could happen, I suppose. Most often you'd have one of them take the lead and subcontract out to the other, but there may be some joint ventures that happen there. So fractional ownership, yeah, I don't know that we'll talk a whole lot about that. So there's some other just ending questions, so that should do it. But relatively short chapter in terms of the PowerPoint here and whatnot, but a whole lot of information, and believe me, we'll talk a lot about that when those folks come in. So thanks and have a good day.